Chapter 2. Later, in the utter blackness of the great, arched cellar, Jones cursed the childish naivete which had brought him there. For the first half-hour he had kept flashing on his pocket light at intervals, but now just sitting in the dark on one of the visitors' benches had become a more nerve-wracking thing. Every time the beam shot out, it lighted up some morbid, grotesque object, a guillotine, a nameless hybrid monster, a pasty bearded face, crafty with evil, a body with red torrents streaming from a severed throat. Jones knew that no sinister reality was attached to these things, but after that first half-hour he preferred not to see them. Why he had bothered to humour that madman he could scarcely imagine. It would have been much simpler merely to have let him alone or to have called in a mental specialist. Probably, he reflected, it was the fellow feeling of one artist for another. There was so much genius in Rogers that he deserved every possible chance to be helped quietly out of his growing mania. Any man who could imagine and construct the incredibly lifelike things that he had produced was surely not far from actual greatness. He had the fancy of a Sime or a Doré joined to the minute scientific craftsmanship of a Blatchka. Indeed, he had done for the world of nightmare what the Blatchkas, with their marvelously accurate plant models of finely wrought and coloured glass, had done for the world of botany. At midnight, the strokes of a distant clock filtered through the darkness, and Jones felt cheered by the message from a still surviving outside world. The vaulted museum chamber was like a tomb, ghastly in its utter solitude. Even a mouse would be cheering company, yet Rogers had once boasted that, for certain reason, as he said, no mice or even insects ever came near the place. That was very curious, yet it seemed to be true. The deadness and silence were virtually complete. If only something would make a sound. He shuffled his feet, and the echoes came spectrally out of the absolute stillness. He coughed, but there was something mocking in the staccato reverberations. He could not, he vowed, begin talking to himself. That meant nervous disintegration. Time seemed to pass with abnormal and disconcerting slowness. He could have sworn that hours had elapsed since he last flashed the light on his watch. Yet here was only the stroke of midnight. He wished that his senses were not so preternaturally keen. Something in the darkness and stillness seemed to have sharpened them, so that they responded to faint intimations hardly strong enough to be called true impressions. His ears seemed at times to catch a faint, elusive susurrus which could not quite be identified with the nocturnal hum of the squalid streets outside, and he thought of vague, irrelevant things like the music of the spheres and the unknown, inaccessible life of alien dimensions pressing on our own. Rogers often speculated about such things. The floating specks of light in his blackness-drowned eyes seemed inclined to take on curious symmetries of pattern and motion. He had often wondered about those strange rays from the unplumbed abyss which scintillate before us in the absence of all earthly illumination. But he had never known any that behaved just as these were behaving. They lacked the restful aimlessness of ordinary light specks, suggesting some will and purpose remote from any terrestrial conception. Then there was that suggestion of odd stirrings. Nothing was open, yet in spite of the general draftlessness, Jones felt that the air was not uniformly quiet. There were intangible variations in pressure, not quite decided enough to suggest the loathsome pourings of unseen elementals. It was abnormally chilly, too. He did not like any of this. The air tasted salty, as if it were mixed with the brine of dark, subterrene waters, and there was a bare hint of some odour of ineffable mustiness. In the daytime he had never noticed that the waxen figures had an odour. Even now that half-received hint was not the way wax figures ought to smell. It was more like the faint smell of specimens in a natural history museum. Curious, in view of Roger's claims that his figures were not all artificial. Indeed, it was probably that claim which made one's imagination conjure up the olfactory suspicion. One must guard against excesses of the imagination. Had not such things driven poor Rogers mad? But the utter loneliness of this place was frightful. Even the distant chimes seemed to come from across cosmic gulfs. It made Jones think of that insane picture which Rogers had showed him, the wildly carved chamber with the cryptic throne, which the fellow had claimed was part of a 3-million-year-old ruin in the shunned and inaccessible solitudes of the Arctic. Perhaps Rogers had been to Alaska, but that picture was certainly nothing but stage scenery. It couldn't normally be otherwise, with all that carving and those terrible symbols, and that monstrous shape supposed to have been found on that throne. What a flight of diseased fancy! Jones wondered just how far he actually was from the insane masterpiece in wax. Probably it was kept behind that heavy, padlocked plank door leading somewhere out of the workroom, but it would never do to brood about a waxen image. Was not the present room full of such things, some of them scarcely less horrible than the dreadful It? And beyond a thin canvas screen on the left was the adults-only alcove with its nameless phantoms of delirium. The proximity of the numberless waxen shapes began to get on Jones's nerves more and more as the quarter hours wore on. He knew the museum so well that he could not get rid of their usual images, even in the total darkness. Indeed, the darkness had the effect of adding to the remembered images certain very disturbing, imaginative overtones. The guillotine seemed to creak, and the bearded face of Landru, slayer of his 50 wives, twisted itself into expressions of monstrous menace. From the severed throat of Madame de Mere, a hideous bubbling sound seemed to emanate, while the headless, legless victim of a trunk murder tried to edge closer and closer on its gory stumps. Jones began shutting his eyes to see if that would dim the images, but found it was useless. Besides, when he shut his eyes, the strange, purposeful patterns of light specks became more disturbingly pronounced. Then suddenly he began trying to keep the hideous images he had formerly been trying to banish. He tried to keep them because they were giving place to still more hideous ones. In spite of himself, his memory began reconstructing the utterly non-human blasphemies that lurked in the obscurer corners, and these lumpish hybrid growths oozed and wriggled toward him as though hunting him down in a circle. Black Tathogua molded itself from a toad-like gargoyle to a long, sinuous line with hundreds of rudimentary feet, and a lean, rubbery night gaunt spread its wings as if to advance and smother the watcher. Jones braced himself to keep from screaming. He knew he was reverting to the traditional terrors of his childhood and resolved to use his adult reason to keep the phantoms at bay. It helped a bit, he found, to flash the light again. Frightful as were the images it showed, these were not as bad as what his fancy called out of the utter blackness. But there were drawbacks. Even in the light of his torch, he could not help suspecting a slight, furtive trembling on the part of the canvas partition, screening off the terrible adults-only alcove. He knew what lay beyond and shivered. Imagination called up the shocking form of fabulous Yog-Sothoth, only a congeries of iridescent globes, yet stupendous in its malign suggestiveness. What was this accursed mass, slowly floating toward him and bumping on the partition that stood in the way? A small bulge in the canvas far to the right suggested the sharp horn of Gnof K, the hairy myth thing of the Greenland ice, that walked sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, and sometimes on 6. To get this stuff out of his head, Jones walked boldly toward the hellish alcove with torch burning steadily. Of course, none of his fears was true. Yet, Were not the long facial tentacles of great Cthulhu actually swaying, slowly and insidiously? He knew they were flexible, but he had not realized that the draft caused by his advance was enough to set them in motion. Returning to his former seat outside the alcove, he shut his eyes and let the symmetrical light specks do their worst. The distant clock boomed a single stroke. Could it be only one? He flashed the light on his watch and saw that it was precisely that hour. It would be hard indeed waiting for morning. Rogers would be down at about 8 o'clock, ahead of even Orobona. It would be light outside in the main basement long before that, but none of it could penetrate here. All the windows in this basement had been bricked up, but the 3 small ones facing the court. A pretty bad wait, all told. His ears were getting most of the hallucinations now, for he could swear he heard stealthy, plodding footsteps in the workroom beyond the closed and locked door. He had no business thinking of that unexhibited horror, which Rogers called it. The thing was a contamination. It had driven its maker mad, and now even its picture was calling up imaginative terrors. It could not be in the workroom. It was very obviously beyond that padlocked door of heavy planking. Those steps were certainly pure imagination. Then he thought he heard the key turn in the workroom door. Flashing on his torch, he saw nothing but the ancient 6-paneled portal in its proper position. Again he tried darkness and closed eyes, but there followed a harrowing illusion of creaking, not the guillotine this time, but the slow, furtive opening of the workroom door. He would not scream. Once he screamed, he would be lost. There was a sort of padding or shuffling audible now, and it was slowly advancing toward him. He must retain command of himself. Had he not done so when the nameless brain shapes tried to close in on him? The shuffling crept nearer, and his resolution failed. He did not scream, but merely gulped out a challenge. "Who goes there? Who are you? What do you want?" There was no answer, but the shuffling kept on. Jones did not know which he feared most to do, turn on his flashlight or stay in the dark while the thing crept upon him. This thing was different, he felt profoundly. From the other terrors of the evening, his fingers and throat worked spasmodically. Silence was impossible, and the suspense of utter blackness was beginning to be the most intolerable of all conditions. Again he cried out hysterically, "Halt! Who goes there?" as he switched on the revealing beams of his torch. Then, paralyzed by what he saw, he dropped the flashlight and screamed, not once but many times. Shuffling toward him in the darkness was the gigantic, blasphemous form of a black thing, not wholly ape and not wholly insect. Its hide hung loosely upon its frame, and its rugose, dead-eyed rudiment of a head swayed drunkenly from side to side. Its forepaws were extended, with talons spread wide, and its whole body was taut with murderous malignity despite its utter lack of facial expression. After the screams and the final coming of darkness, it leaped and in a moment had Jones pinned to the floor. There was no struggle, for the watcher had fainted. Jones's fainting spell could not have lasted more than a moment, for the nameless thing was apishly dragging him through the darkness when he began recovering consciousness. What started him fully awake were the sounds which the thing was making, or rather, the voice with which it was making them. That voice was human, and it was familiar. Only one living being could be behind the hoarse, feverish accents which were chanting to an unknown horror. It was howling. "I am coming, O Ran-Tagoth, coming with the nourishment. You have waited long and fed ill, but now you shall have what was promised. That and more, for instead of Orobona, it will be one of high degree who had doubted you. You shall crush and drain him with all his doubts and grow strong thereby. And ever after among men he shall be shown as a monument to your glory. Ran-Tagoth, infinite and invincible, I am your slave and high priest. You are hungry, and I provide. I read the sign and have led you forth. I shall feed you with blood, and you shall feed me with power. Shobniggereth, the goat with 1,000 young. In an instant all the terrors of the night dropped from Jones like a discarded cloak. He was again master of his mind, for he knew the very earthly and material peril he had to deal with. This was no monster of fable, but a dangerous madman. It was Rogers, dressed in some nightmare covering of his own insane designing, and about to make a frightful sacrifice to the devil god he had fashioned out of wax. Clearly he must have entered the workroom from the rear courtyard, donned his disguise, and then advanced to seize his neatly trapped and fear-broken victim. His strength was prodigious, and if he was to be thwarted, one must act quickly. Counting on the madman's confidence in his unconsciousness, he determined to take him by surprise, while his grasp was relatively lax. The feel of a threshold told him he was crossing into the pitch-black workroom. With the strength of mortal fear, Jones made a sudden spring from the half-recumbent posture in which he was being dragged. For an instant he was free of the astonished maniac's hands, and in another instant a lucky lunge in the dark had put his own hands at his captor's weirdly concealed throat. Simultaneously, Rogers gripped him again, and without further preliminaries the two were locked in a desperate struggle of life and death. Jones's athletic training, without doubt, was his sole salvation, for his mad assailant, freed from every inhibition of fair play, decency, or even self-preservation, was an engine of savage destruction as formidable as a wolf or panther. Guttural cries sometimes punctured the hideous tussle in the dark. Blood spurted, clothing ripped, and Jones at last felt the actual throat of the maniac, shorn of its spectral mask. He spoke not a word, but put every ounce of energy into the defense of his life. Rogers kicked, gouged, butted, bit, clawed, and spat, yet found strength to yelp out actual sentences at times. Most of his speech was in a ritualistic jargon full of references to it or Rantegoth, and to Jones's overwrought nerves it seemed as if the cries echoed from an infinite distance of demoniac snortings and bayings. Toward the last they were rolling on the floor, overturning benches or striking against the walls and the brick foundations of the central melting furnace. Up to the very end, Jones could not be certain of saving himself, but chance finally intervened in his favor. A jab of his knee against Rogers' chest produced a general relaxation, and a moment later he knew he had won. Though hardly able to hold himself up, Jones rose and stumbled about the walls seeking the light switch, for his flashlight was gone, together with most of his clothing. As he lurched along, he dragged his limp opponent with him, fearing a sudden attack when the madman came to. Finding the switch box, he fumbled till he had the right handle. Then, as the wildly disordered workroom burst into sudden radiance, he set about binding Rogers with such cords and belts as he could easily find. The fellow's disguise, or what was left of it, seemed to be made of a puzzlingly queer sort of leather. For some reason, it made Jones's flesh crawl to touch it, and there seemed to be an alien, rusty odor about it. In the normal clothes beneath it was Roger's keyring, and this the exhausted victor seized as his final passport to freedom. The shades at the small slit-like windows were all securely drawn, and he let them remain so. Washing off the blood of battle at a convenient sink, Jones donned the most ordinary-looking and least ill-fitting clothes he could find on the costume hooks. Testing the door to the courtyard, he found it fastened with a spring lock which did not require a key from the inside. He kept the key ring, however, to admit him on his return with aid, for plainly the thing to do was to call in an alienist. There was no telephone in the museum, but it would not take long to find an all-night restaurant or chemist's shop where one could be had. He had almost opened the door to go when a torrent of hideous abuse from across the room told him that Rogers, whose visible injuries were confined to a long, deep scratch down the left cheek, had regained consciousness. Fool, spawn of North Yiddick and effluvium of Cthulhu, son of the dogs that howl in the maelstrom of Azathoth, you would have been sacred and immortal, and now you are betraying it and its priest. Beware, for it is hungry. It would have been Orabona, that damned treacherous dog, ready to turn against me and it, but I give you the first honor instead. Now you must both beware, for it is not gentle without its priest. Aye, vengeance is at hand. Do you know you would have been immortal? Look at the furnace. There is a fire ready to light, and there is wax in the kettle. I would have done with you as I have done with other once living forms. Hey, you, who have vowed all my effigies are waxen, would have become a waxen effigy yourself. The furnace was all ready. When it had had its fill, and you were like that dog I showed you, I would have made your flattened, punctured fragments immortal. Wax would have done it. Haven't you said I'm a great artist? Wax in every pore, wax over every square inch of you. And ever after the world would have looked at your mangled carcass and wondered how I ever imagined and made such a thing. Hi, and Orabona would have come next, and others after him, and thus would my waxen family have grown. Dog, do you still think I made all my effigies? Why not say preserved? You know by this time the strange places I've been to and the strange things I've brought back. Coward, you could never face the dimensional shambler whose hide I put on to scare you. The mere sight of it alive, or even the full-fledged thought of it, would kill you instantly with fright. It waits hungry for the blood that is the life. Rogers, propped against the wall, swayed to and fro in his bonds. See here, Jones, if I let you go, will you let me go? It must be taken care of by its high priest. Orabona will be enough to keep it alive, and when he is finished, I will make his fragments immortal in wax for the world to see. It could have been you, but you have rejected the honor. I won't bother you again. Let me go, and I will share with you the power that it will bring me. Great is Ran-Tegoth. Let me go, it is starving down there beyond that door, and if it dies, the old ones can never come back. Hi, let me go. Jones merely shook his head, though the hideousness of the showman's imaginings revolted him. Rogers, now staring wildly at the padlocked plank door, thumped his head again and again against the brick wall and kicked with his tightly bound ankles. Jones was afraid he would injure himself and advanced to bind him more firmly to some stationary object. Writhing, Rogers edged away from him and set up a series of frenetic ululations whose utter monstrous unhumanness was appalling and whose sheer volume was almost incredible. It seemed impossible that any human throat could produce noises so loud and piercing, and Jones felt that if this continued, there would be no need to telephone for aid. It could not be long before a constable would investigate, even granting that there were no listening neighbors in this deserted warehouse district.
"Woosah-yay! Woosah-yay!" howled the madman. "Yikahampo ae Ran-Tegoth Cthulhu ftagn ae Ran-Tegoth Ran-Tegoth Ran-Tegoth."
The tautly trussed creature, who had started squirming his way across the littered floor, now reached the padlocked plank door and commenced knocking his head thunderously against it. Jones dreaded the task of binding him further and wished he were not so exhausted from the previous struggle. This violent aftermath was getting hideously on his nerves, and he began to feel a return of the nameless qualms he had felt in the dark. Everything about Rogers and his museum was so hellishly morbid and suggestive of black vistas beyond life. It was loathsome to think of the waxen masterpiece of abnormal genius which must at this very moment be lurking close at hand in the blackness beyond the heavy, padlocked door. And now something happened which sent an additional chill down Jones's spine and caused every hair, even the tiny growth on the backs of his hands, to bristle with a vague fright beyond classification. Rogers had suddenly stopped screaming and beating his head against the stout plank door and was straining up to a sitting posture, head cocked on one side, as if listening intently for something. All at once a smile of devilish triumph overspread his face, and he began speaking intelligibly again, this time in a hoarse whisper contrasting oddly with his former stentorian howling. "Listen, fool, listen hard. It has heard me and is coming. Can't you hear it splashing out of its tank down there at the end of the runway?" I dug it deep, because there was nothing too good for it. It is amphibious, you know, you saw the gills in the picture. It came to the earth from lead-grey Ugoth, where the cities are under the warm, deep sea. It can't stand up in there, too tall, has to sit or crouch. Let me get my keys, we must let it out and kneel down before it. Then we will go out and find a dog or cat, or perhaps a drunken man, to give it the nourishment it needs. It was not what the madman said, but the way he said it that disorganized Jones so badly. The utter insane confidence and sincerity in that crazed whisper were damnably contagious. Imagination, with such a stimulus, could find an active menace in the devilish wax figure that lurked unseen just beyond the heavy planking. Eyeing the door in unholy fascination, Jones noticed that it bore several distinct cracks, though no marks of violent treatment were visible on this side. He wondered how large a room or closet lay behind it, and how the waxen figure was arranged. The maniac's idea of a tank and runway was as clever as all his other imaginings. Then in one terrible instant, Jones completely lost the power to draw a breath. The leather belt he had seized for Rogers' further strapping fell from his limp hands, and a spasm of shivering convulsed him from head to foot. He might have known the place would drive him mad, as it had driven Rogers. And now he was mad. He was mad, for he now harbored hallucinations more weird than any which had assailed him earlier that night. The madman was bidding him hear the splashing of a mythical monster in a tank beyond the door, and now, God help him, he did hear it. Rogers saw the spasm of horror reach Jones's face and transform it to a staring mask of fear. He cackled. "At last, fool, you believe. At last you know. You hear it and it comes. Get me my keys, fool. We must do homage and serve it." But Jones was past paying attention to any human words, mad or sane. Phobic paralysis held him immobile and half-conscious, with wild images racing phantasmagorically through his helpless imagination. There was a splashing, there was a padding or shuffling as of great wet paws on a solid surface. Something was approaching. Into his nostrils from the cracks in that nightmare plank door poured a noisome animal stench, like and yet unlike that of the mammal cages at the zoological gardens in Regent's Park. He did not know now whether Rogers was talking or not. Everything real had faded away, and he was a statue obsessed with dreams and hallucinations so unnatural that they became almost objective and remote from him. He thought he heard a sniffing or snorting from the unknown gulf beyond the door, and when a sudden baying, trumpeting noise assailed his ears, he could not feel sure that it came from the tightly bound maniac, whose image swam uncertainly in his shaken vision. The photograph of that accursed, unseen wax thing persisted in floating through his consciousness. Such a thing had no right to exist. Had it not driven him mad? Even as he reflected, a fresh evidence of madness beset him. Something, he thought, was fumbling with the latch of the heavy padlocked door. It was patting and pawing and pushing at the planks. There was a thudding on the stout wood which grew louder and louder. The stench was horrible, and now the assault on that door from the inside was a malign, determined pounding like the strokes of a battering ram. There was an ominous cracking, a splintering, a welling photo, a falling plank, a black paw ending in a crab-like claw. "Help! Help! God help me!" With intense effort, Jones is today able to recall a sudden bursting of his fear paralysis into the liberation of frenzied automatic flight. What he evidently did must have paralleled curiously the wild, plunging flights of maddest nightmares, for he seems to have leaped across the disordered crypt at almost a single bound, yanked open the outside door which closed and locked itself after him with a clatter, sprung up the worn stone steps 3 at a time, and raced frantically and aimlessly out of that dank, cobblestoned court and through the squalid streets of Southwark. Here the memory ends. Jones does not know how he got home, and there is no evidence of his having hired a cab. Probably he raced all the way by blind instinct, over Waterloo Bridge, along the Strand and Charing Cross, and up Haymarket and Regent Street to his own neighbourhood. He still had on the queer melange of museum costumes when he grew conscious enough to call the doctor. A week later, the nerve specialists allowed him to leave his bed and walk in the open air. But he had not told the specialists much. Over his whole experience hung a pall of madness and nightmare, and he felt that silence was the only course. When he was up, he scanned intently all the papers which had accumulated since that hideous night, but found no reference to anything queer at the museum. How much, after all, had been reality? Where did reality end and morbid dream begin? Had his mind gone wholly to pieces in that dark exhibition chamber, and had the whole fight with Rogers been a phantasm of fever? It would help to put him on his feet if he could settle some of these maddening points. He must have seen that damnable photograph of the wax image called It, for no brain but Rogers could ever have conceived such a blasphemy. It was a fortnight before he dared to enter Southwark Street again. He went in the middle of the morning when there was the greatest amount of sane, wholesome activity around the ancient, crumbling shops and warehouses. The museum's sign was still there, and as he approached, he saw that the place was open. The gateman nodded in a pleasant recognition as he summoned up the courage to enter, and in the vaulted chamber below an attendant touched his cap cheerfully. Perhaps everything had been a dream. Would he dare to knock at the door of the workroom and look for Rogers? Then Orabona advanced to greet him. His dark, sleek face was a trifle sardonic, but Jones felt that he was not unfriendly. He spoke with a trace of accent. "Good morning, Mr. Jones. It is some time since we have seen you here. Did you wish Mr. Rogers?" "I'm sorry, but he is away. He had word of business in America and had to go." "Yes, it was very sudden. I am in charge now, here and at the house. I try to maintain Mr. Rogers' high standard. Tilly is back." The foreigner smiled, perhaps from affability alone. Jones scarcely knew how to reply, but managed to mumble out a few inquiries about the day after his last visit. Orobona seemed greatly amused by the questions and took considerable care in framing his replies. "Oh yes, Mr. Jones, the 28th of last month. I remember it for many reasons. In the morning, before Mr. Rogers got here, you understand, I found the workroom in quite a mess. There was a great deal of cleaning up to do. There had been late work, you see, important new specimen given its secondary baking process. I took complete charge when I came. It was a hard specimen to prepare, but of course Mr. Rogers has taught me a great deal. He is, as you know, a very great artist. When he came, he helped me complete the specimen. Helped very materially, I assure you, but he left soon without even greeting the men. As I tell you, he was called away suddenly. There were important chemical reactions involved. They made loud noises. In fact, some teamsters in the court outside fancy they heard several pistol shots. Very amusing idea. As for the new specimen, that matter is very unfortunate. It is a great masterpiece, designed and made, you understand, by Mr. Rogers. He will see about it when he gets back." Again, Orobona smiled. "The police, you know. We put it on display a week ago and there were 2 or 3 faintings. One poor fellow had an epileptic fit in front of it. You see, it is a trifle, stronger than the rest, larger, for one thing. Of course, it was in the adult alcove. The next day, a couple of men from Scotland Yard looked it over and said it was too morbid to be shown, said we'd have to remove it. It was a tremendous shame, such a masterpiece of art, but I didn't feel justified in appealing to the courts in Mr. Rogers' absence. He would not like so much publicity with the police now. But when he gets back... For some reason or other, Jones felt a mounting tide of uneasiness and repulsion. But Orobona was continuing. "You are a connoisseur, Mr. Jones. I am sure I violate no law in offering you a private view. It may be, subject of course to Mr. Rogers' wishes, that we shall destroy the specimen some day, but that would be a crime." Jones had a powerful impulse to refuse the sight and flee precipitately, but Orobona was leading him forward by the arm with an artist's enthusiasm. The adult alcove, crowded with nameless horrors, held no visitors. In the farther corner, a large niche had been curtained off, and to this the smiling assistant advanced. "You must know, Mr. Jones, that the title of this specimen is The Sacrifice to Ran Tegoth." Jones started violently, but Orobona appeared not to notice. The shapeless, colossal god is a feature in certain obscure legends which Mr. Rogers has studied. All nonsense, of course, as you've so often assured Mr. Rogers. It is supposed to have come from outer space and to have lived in the Arctic 3 million years ago. It treated its sacrifices rather peculiarly and horribly, as you shall see. Mr. Rogers had made it fiendishly lifelike, even to the face of the victim. Now, trembling violently, Jones clung to the brass railing in front of the curtained niche. He almost reached out to stop Orobona when he saw the curtain beginning to swing aside, but some conflicting impulse held him back. The foreigner smiled triumphantly. "Behold!" Jones reeled in spite of his grip on the railing. God, great God! Fully 10 feet high, despite a shambling, crouching attitude expressive of infinite cosmic malignancy, a monstrosity of unbelievable horror was shown, starting forward from a cyclopean ivory throne covered with grotesque carvings. In the central pair of its 6 legs it bore a crushed, flattened, distorted, bloodless thing riddled with 1,000,000 punctures and in places seared as with some pungent acid. Only the mangled head of the victim, lolling upside down at one side, revealed that it represented something once human. The monster itself needed no title for one who had seen a certain hellish photograph. That damnable print had been all too faithful, yet it could not carry the full horror which lay in the gigantic actuality. The globular torso, the bubble-like suggestion of a head, the 3 fishy eyes, the foot-long proboscis, the bulging gills, the monstrous capillation of asp-like suckers, the 6 sinuous limbs with their black paws and crab-like claws. God. The familiarity of that black paw, ending in a crab-like claw. Orobona's smile was utterly damnable. Jones choked and stared at the hideous exhibit with a mounting fascination which perplexed and disturbed him. What half-revealed horror was holding and forcing him to look longer and search out details? This had driven Rogers mad. Rogers, supreme artist, said they weren't artificial. Then he localized the thing that held him. It was the crushed waxen victim's lolling head, and something that it implied. This head was not entirely devoid of a face, and that face was familiar. It was like the mad face of poor Rogers. Jones peered closer, hardly knowing why he was driven to do so. Wasn't it natural for a mad egotist to mold his own features into his masterpiece? Was there anything more that subconscious vision had seized on and suppressed in sheer terror? The wax of the mangled face had been handled with boundless dexterity. Those punctures, how perfectly they reproduced the myriad wounds somehow inflicted on that poor dog. But there was something more. On the left cheek, one could trace an irregularity which seemed outside the general scheme, as if the sculptor had sought to cover up a defect of his first modelling. The more Jones looked at it, the more mysteriously it horrified him. And then suddenly he remembered a circumstance which brought his horror to a head, that night of hideousness, the tussle, the bound madman, and the long, deep scratch down the left cheek of the actual living Rogers. Jones, releasing his desperate clutch on the railing, sank in a total faint. Orobona continued to smile.